Hi, everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us today for the Tentative Concrete Artist Talk presented by the Mack Center for Art and Architecture. My name is Gia Yigu. I am the director of the Mack Center for Art and Architecture, a multidisciplinary experimental center for art and architecture that operates from a constellation of historic architectural sites and contemporary exhibition spaces. The Mack Center, for those who are unfamiliar with our organization, we present an annual calendar of exhibitions and programs that challenge the conventional notions of architectural space and relationships between the creative arts. We're headquartered in the landmark Schindler House in West Hollywood, operate an international residency program and exhibition space at the Mackey Apartments in Mid-City, and we run more intimate programming at the Fitzpatrick Leland House in Hollywood. Today, we are delighted to be joined by the Copenhagen-based artists Cecilie Bendixen and Sophus Ejler Jepsen, and Los Angeles-based collaborators Casey Baden and Kenneth Yuen of Full Service Creative. Both artist duos will be speaking on their project and collaboration around Tentative Concrete, which is currently on view in the exhibition Autonomous Design, curated by Priscilla Fraser. Autonomous Design presents the work of 7 contemporary Danish artists, designers, and architects. Produced in collaboration with the Danish Art Foundation, this exhibition focuses on contemporary applications of craft and design in Denmark. Alongside this artist talk, we will be hosting a closing event and catalog launch on September 12th. And I hope some of you will join us for that event. More information is on our website. This event is also being recorded and will eventually live on our online digital archives with captioning. So I might actually be seeing some future visitors then. So today, the 4 artists will be joining us to present aspects of their work and thoughts around the transatlantic collaboration of the production of 2 sculptural works, one based in Los Angeles' Schindler House and the other in Copenhagen. Tentative Concrete is an experiment with new sculptural techniques using concrete and textile formwork. The installations were constructed and installed over 7 weeks, one in the backyard of the Schindler House and the other in the artist's own gardens near Copenhagen, Denmark. Each week, Bendixen and Jepsen shared haptic and tactile instructions with Casey Baden and Kenneth Yuen of Full Service Creative, who interpreted and built the concrete and burlap structures, a trademark of Bendixen's practice in the backyard of the Schindler House in Los Angeles. Visitors were invited to view the fabrication in real time every Saturday from 11 to 3 p.m. between the weeks of May 1st to June 12th. This transatlantic conversation will explore this transformation of a site-specific work, which was where originally the presence of the artist were conceived as necessary and contingent to its production, eventually evolved in response to the climate crisis, and led to the intentional displacement of the artist from the site and the work itself, all while advancing the experimental techniques developed by both Bendixen and Jepsen in their collaborative practice. I'll go over a quick bio and then I'll pass the mic to Cecilie and Sophus. So Cecilie Bendixen and Sophus Ejler Jepsen are a collaborative duo. Bendixen's an artist and architect drawn to natural phenomena. She poetically explores the ways in which essential dynamics can be captured by her sculptures through diverse materials and methods. Sophus Ejler Jepsen works with concrete in a landscape and vegetation sensitive process, applying the improvisational construction principles of the adventure playground or building playground to the formwork and in situ casting. Followed by their presentation, we'll be joined by Full Service Creative, an artist-run custom fabrication shop and project space founded and operated by Baden and Yuen, located in Commerce, California. Full Service Creative centers on collective contribution, where Baden and Yuen bring a range of original projects for artists, creatives, and art institutions to fruition, providing the design, problem-solving, and building services required for each unique vision. Their projects span a wide variety of materials, including wood, metal, concrete, fiber, drywall, video projection, and beyond, resulting in original works of art, sculptural armatures, stretched canvases, performance platforms, studio and exhibition furniture, lofts, and other constructions. As artists, Baden and Yuen are interested in making and context. Baden focuses on the emotional, bodily, and domestic spaces through which craft-based practices, and Yuen works with more sweeping historical and cultural frameworks, concentrating on sculpture. So I'm delighted to be in conversation with all four. Cecilie and Sophus, I will pass the mic on to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear. And we would like to have the next image. Yep, and the next. So, as none of us has seen the entire work in real life, we will start going through what is actually on the two building sites. What you would see if you were visiting the installations. At the same time, I will explain in short the process and what we wanted to inquire with the different elements in the work. The inquiries are bodily. With our bodies, we wanted to explore and experience the nature of materials, the interaction of materials, and the possible spaces established. Photos of the work from Asko will be to the left, and photos from LA to the right. The work is a plinth with steel reinforced concrete columns. The columns are poured in textile formworks. Above these is a rebar construction, and jute textiles are hanging from this structure. Next image. The first thing I will point at in the installation is its broad spectrum of hard and soft visual and tactile sensations. It spans from the massive and heavy concrete columns to the free air. The surface of the columns is textile, as the textile formworks is still there. Sometimes the textile is flooded with concrete and integrated in the column, and sometimes the column surface is the brown jute, and sometimes long textile fringes hangs freely from the sides. In this way, the surface of the column is softened, and the change from concrete to textile becomes gradual. This gradual change is continued by the voluminous knots. The knots are tying the formworks and the free hanging pieces of textile together, and they are braided around the rebar construction to make a softer counterpart to the concrete sculptures. Next image. Made from bundles of threads, the knots are seamlessly connected to the transparent and movable planes of textile. The microgrid in the fabric makes a visual connection to the 3D rebar grid. The unclosed ends of the rebar suggest that the grid is continued invisibly in the free air. The type of spatiality spans from well-defined gaps between the massive concrete columns over abstract 3D drawings above your heads to fluid spaces between the transparent and movable curtains. Next image. With this column, we wanted to explore how textile, rebars, and concrete would work together as a whole. The basically square reinforcement structure inside the column is extended with diagonal arms. Between these arms are 4 long pieces of fabric. These are tied together with fringes made by pushing the vertical threads inwards. This makes a pattern of closed and open areas in the weave. The fringes are also used for tying the fabric tube to the rebar arms to prevent the formworks to collapse or tilt during the pouring. The pouring expands the tube and exhibits the differences in permeability in the weave and the tying in the sides. Next image. With this column, we wanted the pouring and the shaping of the column to interact more closely. So we experimented with shaping the formwork to a tube-like structure while pouring. Before pouring, we made a long jute band with long fringes on both sides. The band was spiraled upwards while it was poured, making a continuous ascending basin. While pouring, the long fringes on the lower side of the band were sunken down into the previous basin. This process resulted in a wild-growing column shape with, as Sophus expressed it, a lot of wonderful disasters. Sunday morning, when full service sent us photo, we could see that they had used a wider band as the steps are much higher. I guess that these steep basins must have been very difficult to control, but Casey and Kenneth solved the situation by tying around the joints. Here the result was a beautifully curved column. Next image. I think because of the gravity, the columns are very easily get horizontal bulges. With this column, we wanted to see if we could make a column with vertical bulges. The column is shaped with 4 narrow tubes twisted around each other. The tubes are connected in the center and twisted around a single rebar. While poured, the formwork was hung from the top and concrete was filled into the narrow tubes with a small shovel. Then the tubes were shaped to make the concrete slide to the bottom. This was a very difficult process, and in LA the tube was instead wetted, which made a more angular shape of stiff textile. And next image. Next image, yeah. And then I will leave the words to Sophus.
Oh. one step back. Can you take the previous, the previous slide? That one, yes. This is the work selected for autonomous design. It's a site-specific collaboratorial investigation into textile formwork for concrete. We were 4 adults and 3 kids, aged 1, 10, and 12 years, living close together for 10 days in the small village of Selde on the south shore of Limfjorden, where Aalborg Portland, the major cement plant of our area, also is located. The nearby coastline is remarkable for its exposed layers of volcanic ashes from volcanic activities in the Oslo area some million years ago. Getting to know the village, its inhabitants and houses on that backdrop, we drew inspiration from the ruins of Pompeii. Level 1, the plinth resembles the pistol layout of so many single-story detached houses in Denmark. Through a rather closed facade to the street, you enter the central corridor with doors to most rooms in the house. After a few meters, you turn in a right angle, enter the living room, and have this modernistic view to the garden. It's so common now, you can sleepwalk any house like that, and still it's stage for endless variation and self-expression. Next slide. In Pompeii, we were amazed by the straight view from street entrance through the main room directly into the garden, behind which a painted wall at first glance put an end to the view. But what mesmerized us even further was the role that painting seems to play in that spot, and then repeatedly in all areas of the house. The motive of the painting was architecture again, and it seems to play with the space you are passing to get there. In these days, before the invention of perspective, they placed tiny figures in the central spot on the wall, and in that way prolonged the view from the street in the main axis of the house. The painted architectural motifs were making puns of imitation itself, starting out in the base as imitation of the plastered walls and columns of the actual house. They evaporate into unlikely thin, impossible constructions populated by fawns and satyrs and draped by weightless textiles, flowers, and garlands. Next slide. Early the same year, before textile houses were executed in Denmark, we were exploring the components of landscape painting in the area of Canavese in the backlands of Milan. The meditative act of mixing and collecting actual tone and shading of a specific moment in time and space were presented as tiny little gardens. The canvas was stretched on sticks from surrounding vineyards by audience itself, who was instructed to carry and form different spaces during the short performance. One space for exploring the landscape as a group, another shutting out the view and listening. Immerse oneself in impressions, textures, and tonality. Next slide. The introduction to Rudolf Schindler's architecture, which we only knew from Saul Steinberg's unlikely architectural fantasies, were for us a flashback to the language of utopian experiments from Bauhaus, De Stijl, or Suprematist, but also to our years at the Academy living in this Le Corbusier built for student families and held cheap by running it as a hotel during summer vacation. It actually worked, very accomplished, and is still running. Though we love the hypnotic imagery of humans blowing up the Anthropocene mountains of modernity, we also mourns the tragic loss of actual solutions, scapegoating for political and economic disasters. Films like Gert Friedrich's The Brute Ego Myth from 2011 gives hope that modernity might be reconsidered and that solutions that actually made a difference on a large scale will stay in practice. Meanwhile, we see our work as a contribution to the obvious emotional challenges of iron-reinforced concrete housing. Next slide. Challenges being of environmental, social, and viral sort, but on a deeper level connected to the emotional, auditive, and tactile experience of concrete and modernity. Next slide. We would like to reopen the panoramic glass wall to nature and replace the emphasis on comfort by an invitation to engagement and immersive practice. We live in a modern version of the traditional Danish horseshoe farm built entirely as workshop for the surrounding Askov Højskole, early 20th century. It's not exactly a Pompeian villa, but the main access through our house and garden is finished off by an undulating wall drawn by Danish landscape architect C.T.H. Sørensen with clear reference to his modern version of romantic gardens. Next slide. Here you see an example of his modern romantic gardens with an undulating wall like the one behind our house. Like the intellectuals of the romantic era, he paid special attention to children and play, noticing how local kids were playing with his building materials after the workers' lift construction site. He coined the term of skrammellegeplads, or adventure playground, and a new concept of the otherwise well-groomed playground you all know from public parks. He wanted to encourage the kids' engagement with materials, tools, and practice, seeing a brighter future for architecture and society as a whole. Next slide. Much the same was going on inside the workshops where we now live. Inge Bjørn were running those workshops with hundreds of high school students each year, offering opportunities to each one of them to immerse oneself in the lost crafts of growing, harvesting, spinning, dyeing, and weaving the clothes that modernity otherwise brought cheap and effortless to your local shop windows. This iconic handbook was conceived and photographed in our garden. You can see the undulating wall behind the spinning girl, and its elaborate language is itself a testimony to the richness of getting back to the trouble. Yeah. In Schindler House, next slide. In Schindler House, we see the construction site as a playground for all ages, a living laboratory to live in. The collective creation and reflection, both visible in this photo and in the floor plan of the house, seems ideal. The rooftop tent in the last picture incarnate for us the essence of modern dreaming, the lost utopian qualities of early modernism, full of romantic ideals, playful approaches, and pure joy of tending at home in your own garden or on your roof, replacing the panoramic glass wall and its annoying echo chamber of bad acoustics with an undulating curtain, letting in the breeze, the smells and sounds of nature and neighborhood, and leaving our voices unechoed, free and calm. Next slide. And yeah, this is just it. Next slide. Yeah.
Okay, so I will continue this context explanation with a description of the process as we saw it from here. Yeah, so there were some different process issues that I will go through, but as a basic method to build from a distance, we decided to build this simultaneous work. We foresaw that we would not be able to predict the nature of materials, how they would interact, or how to solve still unknown problems without getting everything in the hands ourselves. Also, we foresaw that the nature of know-how would, in many cases, be tacit knowledge that could only be communicated in photos. So, by the help of Gia and Mac, we found two pair of good hands and mindsets, and we established a plinth of similar dimensions and with a somewhat similar relation to the house as the one in LA. As the plinth needed to also fit into the organization of our local site, we discussed if the plinth should be in the front of the house, close to the street, in the garden, close to the house, as it is close to the Schindler house, or a little further away in the wilder part of the garden. We decided on the last placement to be able to build wilder. And next image. During the building process, we recognized interesting types of communication issues. First type was about how to communicate, how to create in an intuitive way. The instruction here was a series of photos of diagonal branches and twigs welded on a square center. Moreover, a guide how to think of the shaping. Sophus said, imagine the branches and twigs as birds in a tree with differences as your classmates. And now you could think, why is it important that the shaping is done intuitively? I think it's because the intuitive work can adapt and express here and now circumstances concerning material, handling of materials, surroundings, and so on. It is a fascinating thought that a specific situation can be embedded in a physical form. Next image. Another type of problem was that materials can behave differently according to how you handle them in detail. So from here we can give an instruction of how to do, and still materials can behave in an unforeseen way, or it can be experienced in a different way. In this case, the instruction was to shape column number 1 by tying the UD pieces together in the corners. But Casey must have experienced that the column was getting too thick, or maybe the concrete was about to flow over, so she is tying a bundle around the base of the column. We found it truly fantastic with this kind of local ad hoc solutions, which is pointing directly to the complex situation of handling materials. So many details are crucial. Next image. Next type of problem was how to describe what to do when the results should be in a quite certain way, but the thing to do is hard to describe. I will just give you a little time to skim the text if it's possible, if it's not too small. I don't know if you can see it, but it ends with the words, hope this makes sense. Then there's a lot of rather difficult explanations of exactly what to do. The photos we got Sunday morning from LA showed that Casey and Kenneth has understood everything perfectly. Next image. The last process issue I will mention is this: how to organize the last pieces of materials from a distance. To complete the installation, it should be dressed up with free-hanging jute. As this dressing could be done in many ways, we didn't want to buy new jute, but instead use the small pieces of leftovers for this purpose. So we asked Casey and Kenneth to measure the last pieces, and from this we decided how to organize them in the installation in LA. If you look closely, you can see that the drawn design is not equal to the actual design. The blue rotunda is changed to a flat curtain. So next slide. What we also considered was the surroundings, and Sophus will say a few words about that.
In the beginning, we were hoping that the communication could include this sense of sight, or the sensibility of being in a place. Since we're not there, we could only communicate how we could try to communicate our sense of sight here, and hope that it matched somehow for you guys in LA. And one of the photos that really made us feel that you got something was this photo of the bamboo and the jute, all the threads playing together, and we decided to find something similar here, just to kind of speak back or show back that this is nice, this works, and we want to do the same here. So it has been a very nice dialogue in that way, making something here, hoping you could do something similar in your place, and seeing that you actually found kind of local attachment where you are, in a way. Yeah. Next. This is just final photo showing the engagement with the building and the trees. In LA, you have this wonderful big tree close to the house with what do you say, stem? Yeah, which are for us the metaphor for column, or speaking in the column language, and you have the plinth speaking the architectural language, and we are playing with that both here in Denmark and in LA, still with this Pompeian level, what to say, this Pompeian stair or scale from architecture to very thin, very utopian drawings in the air. Yeah, yep. I think that's it, and we're hoping that you could understand our English. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Full service, we'll pass it on to you.
Hi, thank you guys for hosting this talk. If you want to go to the next slide. Cecilie and Sophus did such a great job sort of describing all the aspects of the project. So our images that follow are just sort of day by day. It was over 7 weeks. So sort of some of the processes that we were each handling. And it's worth mentioning that Kenneth and myself have our own art practices, which sort of lined up nicely with the expectations of this project. I work a lot with textiles, doing weaving, and Ken works a lot with sculpture and has worked with rebar and metal and concrete all before. and we use all these materials in our full service creative business as well. So we felt like we could really, it was a good divide, having each one of us like having more expertise in one category. So I focused on all the textile work while Ken focused on the other materials. So in the middle picture, you can see like the beginning of starting to work with the jute, which was a funny experience for me because normally I'm weaving fabric together on a loom. And in this case, you're quite literally unweaving the fabric, taking the threads apart piece by piece, just sort of like a detailed motion. And then there's Ken on the left side getting the first column put into place. You can go to the next slide. So yeah, some of these are the same images that Cecilie showed there on the bottom, me working with the longer jute on the first column. And in our conversation, we wanted to sort of capture everything, the details of the material that we were working with, the actual like doing the labor in process, you know, myself sitting at the desk, pulling the threads out, Ken working with the seal and the rebar and the plinth, but also getting a sense of the space. Like they said, since they weren't able to come to Los Angeles, we wanted to share like images of the tree, images of the house, images of the plants, and sort of we were constantly in dialogue about you know, what is more organic, what is more intuitive in the space, and what is more architectural, what is like straight lines and on a grid. And there was this constant dialogue and play between the two of how we were installing the pieces. Ken, do you want to add anything? Oh, you're on mute.
I think you covered it pretty much.
Okay, well then we'll go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is on day 3. We've had our first, the first post, I guess, in looking at some of Cecilie and Sophus's previous installations, you can see that all of the columns sort of are formulated differently, but I don't think we really had anticipation of how different the styles of columns would be. So you sort of complete the first one and we were like, oh yeah, like we got a hang of this. You know, at the beginning, you're worried about like the concrete bulging out, or if the concrete is too wet or too hard, just sort of, and the columns are rather thin, and so you're often just like, there's a lot of movement and the way that you're like working with your body and with your hands to like solve the solutions of these materials. So then on day 3, when we got the assignment for the second column, it was a completely different construction, which I think we were both surprised and excited by. So even though we felt like, okay, we'd gotten the hang of the first I guess technique, then we had to sort of do a whole new technique. So as they said, this is the one that sort of made a spiral going upwards, and you tie the spiral together as you're pouring. So you can see on the bottom left, that's like the long piece before any of the concrete has been entered into the structure. And I guess in terms of our experience of concrete in other projects, there's always sort of like a rigid mold. And I think it was really interesting for us to figure out how to work with concrete in a breathing mold, a mold that moves and that is being created sort of in tandem with the pouring. I thought that was like a really unique way to use concrete. And so then, yeah, you can also just see sort of the view, our view on the far right-hand side, looking into the column before you start to pour the concrete. That's sort of where you're going. Next slide. And yeah, this is just sort of an overview picture at the end of that day, the nice light in the Schindler House garden and the relationship between the columns and the trees, which we thought was nice. Next slide. Okay. This is day 4. And again, I'm just kind of showing you all the different pieces before, like in their flow, when it goes from just jute that I've been working with and on the ground in my lap, and then the columns as Kenneth begins to build them. And at this point, I think Sophus and Cecilie had shared with us a like an architectural CAD drawing, which sort of starts to show how to envision the space as more of a room. In the bottom center picture, there's like not a column, but a piece of rod that's a little bit crooked. But we had started to talk about that as going to be the entryway or the doorway, the place that you walk through into this home or space, this room. And then you sort of start to get oriented with what is front, what is back, and how the overhead space would become to be aligned. Next slide. I guess at this point, the small column there, and then what will be the final column, I think the construction methods for each column seemed to get sort of more and more complicated as we went. And so that it was interesting to sort of be newly experiencing each construction method each week, getting the new instructions, and then comparing, you know, we have images of what you guys were creating in Denmark and images of sculptures you'd made before, and sort of feeling, oh, like levels of accomplishment or levels of failure, or feeling like, oh, that's not quite right, or, you know, how did they get that? I think in this one, this had started to be a twisting column, and you have smaller flutes, and the gravity of this and the saturated sort of wetness of the concrete was closing up the holes at the top, and then everything was sinking to the bottom, so that, and then your columns were so long and stretched out. So this felt like a little bit of a failure, but we got the opportunity to try again on the next slide. Oh, well, this is just an overview picture. Next slide. Oh, I'm a little ahead of myself here, but this is at the point when you started to have the overhead construction. And this was interesting because the extensions went beyond the plinth, which I think we weren't expecting at first. So it really, for me, this sort of related a lot to the Schindler house, and that just the way the rooms are constructed, or the way that you could maybe use the roof. You showed that picture of the roof tent of the Schindler house. I don't know, sort of involving this overhead structure and creating sort of a roofing or an extension related to the Schindler house for us. Next slide. Okay, yeah, so then on the far left, you can see that, again, we were trying to do the spirally elongated column structure. And this, similarly to yours, you said that we needed to sort of keep it upright. So we have it sort of banded up for that week, trying to not let the gravity sink everything to the bottom. And then next slide. Yeah, and this is sort of our last day, which I was excited all the way through the project, but the jute hanging freely, not being associated with the concrete. This sort of shows a lot of variety of the knot work and the ties and the fringe, and sort of has like, it's more a decorative flair or embellishment. This was like an area where we could sort of have, we made some decisions sort of on the fly about how to use the leftover pieces as well. So for example, on the left, all those hanging bits, we had been instructed to keep all the leftover threads as I pulled them out of each jute piece. And then I didn't want to just not do anything with them since we'd been keeping them for weeks and weeks. So we got to do this different knots and braiding and sort of, you know, flourishes at the end with the remaining materials. Next slide. And this sort of just shows more of those details. Ken, do you want to add?
Sorry, I think the most interesting thing to me, overarching, not specifically in regards to this slide, is that I was really fascinated by like the translation aspect of this project, because, you know, no matter what there was always like a sense of lost in communication regarding the project. And also one pretty fun thing actually was the translation between like metric and standard measurement systems, or like different names that I guess construction materials, because at the end of the day, right, the materials that we were using are especially the concrete and the rebar are industrial construction materials, you know, that are traditionally used in the act of home building or structure building. So the translation of names was kind of, or in translation of like industry terms, was very, very fascinating to me. And then yeah, and or the different processes that like that went into that were basically instructed. I remember on the first day we were given a tip on how to use on how to get like the spacing right in regards to the building of the actual armatures, the steel armatures, and we were provided by pictures of Sophus using wooden blocks, and here in North America what we would call 2x material, but then 2x only makes sense if talking in inches, but then we were relayed this information in millimeters, but then we typically didn't weld in that manner, so we used magnets, which had their own measuring system, because at the end of the day, while collaborating with other artists, Casey and I do own a fabrication company, right? So like the type of tooling in regards to like one that uses for an art practice versus like professional fabrication, where like efficiency is like the most efficiency and speed of turnaround times is the most one of the more important aspects. So interestingly enough, where, you know, there were conversations where we as Full Service and Sophus and Cecilie did talk about, you know, trying to make things more organic or trying to make things more playful in that regard, because oftentimes playfulness or play are conversations that are talked about in art where efficiency isn't the most prioritized thing. You know, it's like oftentimes when acting as Full Service, not Kenneth, Yuen, and Casey Baden as separate artists or individual artists, you know, like those we often have to think about, you know, budget and efficiency and speed and turnaround times as fabricators when we put our little fabricator hats on, you know. So that led to a certain degree of like freedom, especially in the later parts of this job or this collaboration, in a sense that we understood or came to the confident realization that this wasn't just a fabrication job we took on. We took on a collaborative effort in regards to like fulfilling another two artists' and in that regard, you know, it's like, I don't think for me personally, the act of being a fabricator and the act of being an artist are not entirely separate. They're like, you know, part of my practice is to support other people's practices in the regard of like, obviously the technical aspect. I've been I've been helping people make their work, I've been helping other people make their work for a really long time now at this point. So I've come to a realization that, like, you know, maybe the position or role or whatever the word you want to use is of myself and Casey too now does play a part. You know, we do play a part in, as fabricators, in helping artists fulfill their vision, and that relationship is like a fluid one oftentimes.
I think there's one more slide if we want to go to the final view. If this might be the end, I'm not sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think just tailing off of Ken and sort of maybe getting more into the conversation part of this program was, yeah, all the layers of translation, from the basic things like numbers and millimeters and materials in different forms, all the way to, you know, Sophus and Cecilie speak another language. So when we would meet on Zoom, I know sometimes we'd all get sort of tripped up in our language. And then as I wanted to make sure each week that we were following the instructions to the best of our ability. So I would be sitting there with Ken, reading out loud, like line by line, some of those graphics that Cecilie showed earlier. I would read it, you know, 4 to 20 times each weekend out loud to Ken, so to make sure, like, okay, are we on track? Are we on track? Have we done this? Like, is this the right way? How does this not work? So I think that sort of their presence, even though we usually only spoke for we didn't even really video chat every week, but we emailed throughout the week, and we would video chat, you know, maybe every other week. I still felt like their presence was like a part of our daily work on each week that we were working. And then also being at the Max Center, it was an interesting, we weren't in our workshop, we weren't in our backyard, we were in this public facing institution, and there was, you know, you want to make a workspace as clean as possible while it's being viewed. So sort of keeping track of, like, you know, washing down the plinth each week before we left, or not interfering with any of the garden as we set up our desk or the welder or the concrete mixer. I think that was another huge part of the experience, just how to work in public, which was an interesting time for us. So yeah, I think that's sort of the overview of our experience of the project.
I think one more thing to add is that, like, Cecilie and Sophus were working in their, like, in the bound and within the place of their home, right? And like Casey and I were working at like a historical / public place, and then there was an aspect of like somewhat not performance, but like, you know, the aspect of viewability, and then we like that there was I feel like, I don't know what the exact word to use is, but there was a certain degree of like audienceship, or like potential audienceship for a potential sort of like self-consciousness in regards to potentially the work being viewed like, or like a potential read of the work as like a performance or a certain type of theater, because like we were being viewed, you know, it was like we were working during the hours of the open viewership. So I think that's like one interesting aspect that was added to the making of the work, which was the making of the work being very, very much part of the work, not just like that final the final arrival at the piece that you can see today at the Max Center.
Yeah, I found myself wondering, people who came on day one, if they ended up coming back to see how it looked at the end, because we did engage with some people and tell them, oh, you know, that it's in process. So I wonder if people enjoyed it more than once.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for this really wonderful presentation on your work. I think we can stop sharing screen and just bring all of the speakers together in one digital space. Thank you, Tristan. Okay, so it was really wonderful for me to hear more about your processes and to learn about some of the specificities in which the instructions were being conveyed. It's a little bit like an Easter egg. I'd like to start the conversation around some of both your practices around concrete and to unpack your response to concrete as a sculptural medium. So what I found most interesting around both of your work is a kind of clear intention to the uses of concrete as a material. So you are experimenting with concrete as a process-based craft rather than a form-based craft. I'm also, some of this will play into this question of softness with the jute material, which I think is a very unusual but super experimental way to produce concrete form. So if you think about concrete as something that requires a mold to produce, the mold is often a very static form, and then the concrete is just a copy of the mold. So in this case, the form isn't predetermined by the mold. There's a specific interaction between the two, which depends on how much concrete you put into it, how quickly it dries in relation to humidity and heat, and then the bulging of the concrete when it's wet or not wet. There's this preconceived notion of concrete as a fluid material rather than a solid material like wood. But rather than understanding concrete as subtractive or additive, you're very intentional in your response that it's fluid, that it drips, leaks, bulges, and you're really playing up the fluidity as an aspect of form making that's important to the project itself. And then you've kind of inserted into your work the fact that concrete is time-based, that will change over time. And I really like that part of the project. I think that's a super, you know, kind of like provocative understanding of material in general. And then of course, the softness of the jute really solidifies the you know, this idea of concrete as a material that exists in a constant preparatory state rather than a final state. So I think I'm, you know, trying to get to this question, more than being interested in concrete as a final thing, you're very interested in its process and preparation. And I wonder if both of you could speak to, you know, I know Casey, you've produced concrete works also similarly, I think, and I would love to hear more about these ideas in which you're thinking about concrete very intentionally as a material. I have later on some questions about this question of labor and artistic authorship we'll go into, but maybe first starting with the material itself and how you guys have sort of crafted it so intentionally. And I think any of you could speak.
Well, seen from here, the concrete is local material. It's made from clay and caulk in the subterranean part of Denmark. So you can go into the field and you can find what you need to make concrete yourself, and then you mix it up with sand and gravel from the beach, or yeah. And in that sense, I think it has another quality than the modernistic detached feeling of when you see modern architecture, you have the feeling of it being something alien, but here it feels like a local. It has so many local properties, and it's interesting to work with the raw materials and mixing it, experiencing the, yeah, like you said, the fluid nature of it, and
yeah. So we try to make it kind of a part of the garden that's some part was taken up from the ground in a way, and with the jute it could decompose in the garden. Some parts of it could do that, so it was a process.
That's so.
I think. Oh, go ahead, Casey.
I mean, that's so cool. Just that you said you were making part of the concrete that you're using in the sculpture from the clay and sand in your neighborhood. I think for us, we didn't have that benefit. You know, we're just buying it from a commercial space, so it doesn't feel local in that way. We couldn't dig up the ground or go to the beach and pick up the sand. So that's a big difference.
I think, and also in regards to like the question of locality, right? Concrete is and or not specifically California, but then like, for example, the United States, concrete actually isn't really used that much specifically for example, in residential home building, right? It's often used like in specificness of like pouring foundations, then anything where up from the foundation is built out of wood in North America. But specific to California, I think one of the interesting things about concrete is that oftentimes there's like often very like, political conversations wrapped around concrete, especially in relationship to its relationship to like brutalist architecture or like communist architecture or Marxist architecture. But then the one thing that I kept thinking about in regards to concrete is that its heavy water usage, like the amount of water that it uses to produce it. And living in California or working in California, like water is a very, very political material or resource. And like especially like, you know, California is a drought land, you know, and I every time I work with concrete, I think about it, you know, and I'm sure in if I'm not mistaken, Denmark is pretty rain heavy, right? So yeah, I mean, in regards to concrete in that sense, like that was one thing that I thought about a lot.
Yeah, and I mentioned in the talk a little, this was a totally different application of concrete from anything we'd ever done before. You know, we've made benches or some, you know, more commercially oriented structures that do have the rigid mold and that are all about its solidness. And in this way, yeah, Gia, as you were saying, it was all about process. It was all about its fluidity, all about the way that it was breathing and moving and clumping and sort of trying to gently guide it into its form. And also there was like a vibration process for each column. So then you see it feels like the relationship between the jute and the concrete is like breathing, because the concrete is like sort of inside the jute at first, and then you vibrate it and it expands. And that's sort of like watching it settle or watching it come into its position was really beautiful.
You were also speaking to this idea, well, okay, my son's intruding. You were also hold on one second. I'm so sorry. Okay. Let's go to another room. Hold on.
That's fine. Yeah, I think as you said, Casey, they just very near experience with the concrete is very interesting, and the elements for the sculpture is of course very specifically chosen. So we have this jute that can hold it back, and the concrete that will expand, and yeah, the rebar is a more abstract drawing material in a way. Yeah, so there's very bodily experience when you make these sculptures with these contracting and expanding yeah, materials.
It's surprising too with the jute how it's a fairly loosely woven fabric to begin with. So then when it gets wet or it's engaged with like a heaviness or gravity, the property of the fabric also sort of expands in ways that some other fabric maybe doesn't. You know, the density of the weave and the way that the fabric, I think, expands in a similar way with the concrete.
You both mentioned a little bit about some of the environmental impacts, but also the life cycles of these materials. And you know, you can't think about the concrete sculpture without thinking about its relationship to the Schindler House, which is essentially a 100-year-old sculpture. We will celebrate the 100-year next year. But one thing we're learning about the 100-year anniversary is that concrete, despite the fact that we've always conceived of it as a kind of permanent material, it has, especially modern concrete, I think a mixture of its aggregate and chemical properties. It has a lifespan of 100 years. It obsolesces at 100 years, especially around the rebar. And so we have this added challenge of, the conservation of the house, which is that there is an inherent quality of the concrete, which is that it just obsolesces. It's struggling to stay together and intact. And you also were all interested in a little bit of these dynamics of the environment and the climate crisis in relationship to the material concrete, whether it's a kind of sustainable material or, as Kenneth's put it, it is resource intensive, right? It takes a lot of water. In Los Angeles, it's also a resource intensive material in terms of labor. So we don't have an extremely robust labor force that knows how to work through concrete through a kind of skilled manner, especially around building construction. I wonder, Cecilie and Sophus, you guys had spoken to this idea of it being a decision of yours around the climate crisis. Could you speak a little bit to, not coming and the kind of offsetting you were conceiving around the concrete itself?
Yeah, of course, the concrete in itself is not climate. It's not a good climate material. So, to put a little, to reduce the impact of this whole project, we decided not to go to LA because we did a little bit of calculation and found out that we could build 14 of these sculptures inside this CO2. Instead of traveling, we could build 14 of these sculptures. So we decided to stay at home, but I think we are not working with a sustainable material, but what we try to do is to work with the aesthetics of to work with the to kind of introduce a more aesthetic impression or expression of the material, so that it has some connection to the nature around it, and aesthetically, and the way the tactile and the visual impression of it would be more like nature. But so what we try to do is to work with that we get used to a more nature-like impression of designs, so that we can, we see the kind of a transition from this concrete that is everywhere, and then to a more nature-like aesthetic surrounding. So this is not in itself sustainable, but it's kind of a transition project in a way. We're working with the aesthetics of it.
You can say here in Europe, I don't know if the name is the Atlantic Wall, the Third Reich made the Atlantic Wall of concrete, reinforced concrete bunkers all the way down the west coast, and this image still sticks to the material as something evil. And even though you have great social housing projects like the one we were showing in the slides, the one we lived in, with it still has this evil kind of feeling, and we think that modernity as this constructivistic language, or freeing, you could say, freeing concrete from this constructivistic language would or might move it into a new reception, or we hope. Or and at the same time, I think this we were talking about concrete as kind of the construction world's answer to oil or steel. I mean, you have oil and steel and concrete as the main powers of modernity, and if you want to change this, if you want to make a change, you could just move to another field, but you have to connect to this main material in order to change the way we perceive and work with, for instance, concrete for housings. So yeah, I think it's good to see it as a transitional project.
We just have 15 minutes, and I have one more question for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience if they have some. I'd like to shift to talking a little bit about this question of labor in relationship to artistic authorship, which we started discussing before the artist talk. So I think it's just about surfacing that a bit more. So we talked about the notion of process as an integral part of your work, and instructions and improvisation play an important part. But unlike the uses of instruction in certain histories of art in the 70s, specifically around minimalism and process art, you are very keen to acknowledge the fabricators as co-authors of the project. So for artists like Donald Judd and Robert Smithson, there's this history of removing the artist's hand from the production of the work itself by outsourcing the processes of fabrication to external actors, but who are, with such actors not themselves being acknowledged as the artists. And then bring, of course, these industrial processes back into the space of artistic production and signification. One person I admire greatly is Miralay Lederman-Ukeles, who points to this idea of labor and how in erasing with these artists, speaking about labor and production and the intentions of erasing the artist's hand, they were also very clearly erasing certain, they were not necessarily erasing artistic authorship, but they were very much erasing the workers and the fabricators. To point to something that Kenneth said, which is that he doesn't see a distinction between his work as a fabricator and his work as an artist. I wonder if you could talk a little bit around setting up a relationship so that labor and artistic authorship were co-constituents.
Gia, your microphone is lost.
Oh no.
Yeah. Oh, now you're back.
Just the last minute.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted you guys to speak a little bit to your perspectives around labor and artistic authorship and intention, how you were allowing certain forms of agency in the work through these improvisational acts or through the interpretive instruction, and then to hear from Full Service their own perspectives of their ideas of the art worker in relationship to the artist.
I think the idea of authorship is interesting to challenge in the sense that nobody creates alone, or you cannot. I think it's a myth that the artist is like a genius working alone, and the working in collaboration, like in this project, emphasize and even introducing more. What is the finger, the handmade. I mean, you can see more hands in this work than one genius guy, and that's. I think of it as a more intelligent way of creating and sharing and experiencing and experimenting, because we could see from here in the images from LA that new ideas come up, new results, new things that we didn't think of were created. And in that sense, it's much more, it's more rich way of working. And it's a little bit like teaching. If you teach art, it's not interesting to come and say, here is how you do art, and now do like I do, or it doesn't work like that. So in a teaching situation, you try to share problems, ideas, and see what everybody comes up with. And that's the interesting part about teaching or communicating in general inside the art world, or maybe everywhere.
And I think one great experience with this collaboration was also that that if we had done it ourselves at your site, we would maybe not notice what we were doing. In this case, we were taking photos. What did we actually do? Oh, I have to write this down. And sometimes we had the chance that we were doing some instructions, and then Casey and Kenneth, we hope that they would do something better, because for us it did not succeed. So then we hope that it would be better in LA. So yeah, there was a lot of advantages, I think, and very interesting issues.
Yeah, as for us, I think going from our regular work as full service to doing this job, I think it took a week or two to really realize like how collaborative it would be. Either way, you know, we've been happy to work under other people, under their instruction, but this really did feel like collaboration and sort of the back and forth. So really being able to step into a little bit of that authorship or a shared authorship was like a developing experience, I thought. But also, I think you talked about, Gia, you mentioned like people like Judd and stuff. I think there's a big difference when I think of, you know, like Judd, the aluminum boxes, there's 100 of them that all look the same except for like the decisive change. Whereas in this case, I think like the materials we're using are a little bit more craft oriented than maybe industrialized in that same way. And there's very little chance of them being replicated identically the way that some of those other artists maybe were intending. So I think that that's a big shift in this kind of work, is that each one really is unique and site specific and dependent on the time and the weather and the humidity and all of that stuff. So I think it becomes more like more specific in that way.
I mean, to go, whoops, sorry, to go off of the conversation of like craft and like replicability, I think you know, when using a material like jute that is soft, right, and then in using the process of mold making is an indexical process. So it's like mold is here, material goes inside mold, then thing that is produced by mold is a reflection of the mold itself. And then, so, you know, in using concrete, if you had a completely rigid mold, you would have a completely rigid outcome, but then the outcome becomes fluid because the mold material is fluid. But in conversations, and also, you know, to think about what Sophus was talking about previously in regards to like, you know, the myth that the artist creates, like art within a vacuum and singularly and alone, is like, it's interesting that I'm not putting any value judgment on the conversation itself, but I think it's interesting that to this day that like we still talk about it, you know, and I wonder like in other fields, like does that conversation exist in the same way? Because like, for example, in music, right, you have like there are there are sound engineers, there are producers, there are all those kind of things. And in architecture, there's an architect, and then there are builders, you know? So like in every aspect of any form of creation or any form of production, there is the idea head, then there is the people who produce the work. And like I said previously, I personally have come to my own understanding of that relationship. I feel pretty early on in my creative life, that because I've been making other people's work for a long time. I think it's like I say, I think it's interesting that like this is a conversation that we as cultural producers in this specific cultural production field like still talk about.
Yeah, I think so. I wish we could continue this conversation because I think it has something specific to do with the notion of sculpture over profession. But I want to be mindful of our time and to see if the audience might need or might have questions. But Kenneth, I think you're thinking around it is, I think in architecture, it's a similar question. Authorship is a strange idea in a practice that's centered on building, in which building requires many forms of labor. But there's always one name to the building, right? Frank Gehry's, Schindler. So, but not to get away from this, maybe we can continue this in an informal conversation amongst us, and I will just open up the Q&A to the audience. We might have time for like one. And then you guys have to go to your talk. Or I wonder, I think the Q&A, you can also type your questions into the Q&A box. And we can also, while we're waiting for questions, we can continue this conversation around why authorship is still so central. Or I don't know if that's the question you were trying to pose, Kenneth.
I think
why don't you guys, I would love to hear more from both of you, or you and Casey, thinking through that that thought. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the reasons why Casey and I decided to embark on the journey of like creating full service is that like there's something interesting about art fabrication, in the sense that a lot of artists' assistants or artists' hands, right, that work in other artists' studios, work for a specific amount of pay in someone else's studio producing someone else's work, and there's nothing wrong with that until you start thinking about, you know, how much are these people getting paid? What do they have in the end to call theirs in regards to a trade? Or do they only end up with their oftentimes menial pay? Or do they end up, or could we fantasize about a place where the artists have something to call their own in the end, right? For example, in music, you write a demo track or a reference track, you collect royalties. Construction, you get to own your construction company, you know? So this idea of ownership, or this idea of like, what is a fair trade in regards to your production. So I have, like I say, I've repeated many times, I've made a lot of work for a lot of people, right? And I saw, not that I had a problem with it per se, but I was interested in challenging the notion that, like, you know, that I had something to call mine after the work was done. I can always have full service in the end, you know, like, no one can take full service from me, right? In the same way that I'm left with nothing but my pay after the production, after assisting another in the creation of their cultural vision or like creative vision. So that's just my end of that.
I also think for me with full service, it's been a learning opportunity. There are things that I know how to do well, but there are things that I hadn't done before. But working with Ken and working with these other artists, you get new frames of reference or new ideas or new ways of thinking. And then Ken's been really good at designing and problem solving. And oftentimes the artist doesn't even know exactly how they want something to be made, and to be able to like fulfill that or solve that problem or fulfill that goal is something that I really like about like the role of the fabricator. Yeah, I don't know. I just like making things.
Thank you so much.
Maybe-
We have to wrap up the talk in 3 minutes. I wonder if Cecilie and Sophus might have some final words to add, and then we will conclude the artist talk.
I would just say that that I think we are really a little surprised that it took so much from you over there to that you had to invest so much of yourself. I think we did not foresee that totally from the beginning, but yeah, that leaves us very grateful over here that you actually invested so much of yourself in it. So so it's a collaboration. It is totally, yeah.
Maybe we could also end up asking this this idea of Schindler house made by Schindler and fabricated by someone else, maybe also is a myth. And when you look at the footage of him and his fellows tilting up a wall,
Yeah.
I question myself, is it just Schindler, or is it just the way we perceive the creator, and still not have done this discussion, Kenneth, to the end?
That's a great question. And we are trying to find out if there were other workers in the construction of the house. I know there's a ledger in the archives, which we haven't been able to get to, and different historians has very different responses to that. But and hopefully this will be evolved for the Centennial Project itself, this question of the builders behind the building. But I just want to thank all of you so much for your wonderful collaboration. And we've really had such great pleasure to get to know both duos in the development of the work. And I've really enjoyed this conversation as well. I will say this concludes the talk with Tentative Concrete and the 4 artists involved. We'll have this program available online, of course. And thank you all so much for spending a Saturday morning and Saturday evening with us online.
Thank you. Thank you, Gia. Thank you, Cecilie. Thank you, Sophus.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.